Welcome to episode 43 of the Lowdown Show. I'm Neil Graham. This week I speak with Dallas Shannon, a man who's gone from running his own online motorcycle site to manning a school in the mountains of BC for off-road riders. But before we get into our conversation, a word from our sponsor. Picture this: you're halfway through a DIY motorcycle fix, tools scattered everywhere, and boom, you realize you're missing a part. Well, don't fret, because you know whatever it is, it's on eBay. They've got simply everything: brake rotors, lights, entire exhaust systems, whatever you need. And it's guaranteed to fit, which means no more crossing your fingers hoping you ordered the right thing. All the parts you need at prices you'll love, guaranteed to fit every time. eBay. Things people love. We've never spoken, but most of us know you through something called Traction eRag, which was an online publication that you ran. You don't run it anymore. Why not?
COVID killed the Traction eRag. And it was sort of a relationship between our real world life, which was doing tours and training and doing all kinds of events and shenanigans, which actually paid for the magazine to exist. Because as you can imagine, a digital free publication in a PDF format is not generating lots of revenue, which it didn't. It generated enough to pay its costs, but that's about it. So we got into that in 2009, maybe 2008. And I did that publication because I'm a reading and literature nerd. So I was always fascinated with dirt bike magazines. When I was a kid, I collected them and read every word and just hung on every word of the editor. But when I became an adult, I became wise enough to realize it was just a bake-a-cake formula to sell more parts and more bikes and to highlight things. It was just a sales rag, and it didn't really have this soul of off-roading as I saw it at the time. So my idea was, we had so much fun riding on the trail with a group of 3 or 4 guys, and we're falling over and we're terrible and we're laughing and we're covered in mud and eaten by mosquitoes. And the amount of joy that came out of those rides, I wanted to bottle it and somehow shove it into a publication. So that was how it was born. And as it evolved, we grew a global audience by email. And then what happened was people said, hey, we want to come riding with you. So we started bringing people into Canada from all over the world to come riding with us. And what happened was, those rides started to generate more revenue than the magazine ever did. So it was like the revenue from those rides supported the magazine, which was my true love, which is content and commentary. But when COVID showed up, that was the end of international travel or any travel. And that was the death knell for the magazine.
You've continued on with your rides. And so give me an example of what they are. You're in British Columbia, which is an incredible place to ride, on the west coast of Canada. And who comes? What are you trying to do with these rides? What's the point of them?
We want to give them a Canadian experience. So cabins, remote, as much Canada as we can. We're never in places that are populated, because you can visit Toronto and you can visit Vancouver and Montreal. But for me, there are subtle differences, of course, but a city is a city is a city. And to come to Canada and go to Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver and spend all your time there, you're getting no sense of what this country is really, truly about. And I grew up as a country boy, more or less, rural country, hunting, fishing, all that stuff. So to be able to take people into those wilderness areas of Canada, spend a week or more with them, and then show them waterfalls, and we swim in lakes, and we go in the creek, and we shower in the river, and very, very throwback to 14 years old in Canada in a country setting. People are coming from all over the world, Germany, UK, Australia, a lot of Americans. We're getting more and more Canadians, weirdly, in the last maybe 2 to 3 years, it's always been international up to this point, but now there's a lot of Canadians sort of jumping in.
Do you think that as Canadians, as a fellow Canadian, do you think we're blasé about what we have at our doorstep?
I think so. I don't want to be too judgmental, because everyone's different. But I think that if you've never left Canada, if you haven't traveled, it's very difficult to know a place unless you've left for an extended period of time. spent time in other places, and you realize very quickly that things are not the same in other places. So it starts to make you either appreciate what you have in Canada. For some people, it makes them dislike what we have in Canada, depending where you're traveling. But for me, it's always been a real appreciation of Canada and the subtleties of our culture. And people don't, we complain about politics, and we complain about healthcare, and we complain about all these things, but it's like, I turn the tap and hot water comes out. I flick a switch and I get electricity. I go to the grocery store like a Costco, and there's barely any lineups, and everything is at my fingertips. The amount of convenience and luxury we have in this country is just, it's remarkable. And until you've traveled to a developing or third world country, it's hard to fathom how good we have it here in Canada.
I agree with you, and not to make this conversation overtly political, but then again, I am the pod host and podcast master, so I can do what I want to. I mean, the whole fuck Trudeau thing. For those in America, it was essentially our version of sending Biden straight to hell. Never made any sense to me because, I mean, have these people not? I mean, I went to India earlier this year, and I had to fill up form after form after form. My parents' religion, my grandparents' religion, all the things that we would never ask, someone coming here. And it's, we're incredibly privileged. And I mean, the fact that, first of all, let's face it, anyone who can own a motorcycle or multiple motorcycles or take the time to ride off-road or vintage race or whatever you do, you are at the highest percentage in terms of the population of the world who can do something that's utterly frivolous and expensive, because motorcycling is expensive, just like a lot of things are expensive. So this unrelenting complaining about how wretched things are, it just doesn't hold up. Plus, we have a political system in place. If you don't like the prime minister or the president, join the opposing party and get involved. Go door to door. We have a mechanism to depose of our leaders, unlike some countries where you can't do that. So let's do something unusual. Let's talk motorcycles. And I'm just going to throw this at you. So the one thing on advrider.com is if you mention electric motorcycles, it's like sort of confessing that you're a communist in the deep south. You get lots of attention because now, of course, electrification is not a propulsion system. It's a political idea. And my buddy Michael Ularic, who writes for ADV Rider, is always, is a very pro-electric and a very persuasive orator. So there's all of that as well. So, but this is what I find interesting. I rode an electric bicycle, and Intense is the brand, and ended up buying one, and an electric mountain bike. And it is in my mind, it is the absolute perfection for electrification because I can go where bicyclists go. It's of course noiseless, and where I mountain bike is on the side of a very steep escarpment here in Ontario, and I can go all the way down to the bottom. Whereas if I'm on my pedal bike, push bike as the Brits say, I can't go because I have to walk it back to the top. So it's just one of those sweet spots with electricity for me. Now I haven't tried pure electric dirt bikes, and you have. So you've ridden the Stark and the Suron, and give me a sense of what they're like. Are they fun? But are they actually useful for what you want to do in a day?
We did a pretty comprehensive, I think it was a 25-minute video. And I think it was different because what I was searching for was answers to bigger questions and also
is there
subtleties.
A God? Things like that?
Well, just the idea, is it viable? That's what everyone always asks me. Is it viable? Are they ready? And I would say they're almost ready. They're 100% ready for the right person. And, unfortunately or fortunately, as human beings, we always, we're the center of our own universe. So we feel like if it doesn't work for me, it shouldn't work for anyone. And that's just not true. Yeah. I live off grid on a ranch with endless amounts of riding off road, literally right out my door. But lots of people live in the city and they live in the subdivision and they don't have places to ride, and it's got to be stealthy and it has to be respectful, and they don't get to go leave in the morning and come back at 7 p.m. at night and go for, hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. So electric works for certain people, maybe not the majority yet. And some of the subtleties inside that video, or what we were searching for, was I like to reveal or think about things that you didn't expect. So when I'm riding the electric motorcycle for the first time, or the electric dirt bike, all of the little nerdy details really matter to me, and I'm trying to pay attention and observe my experience as it's happening. So when you first get on one, there's 2 levers on the handlebars, and there's no foot controls except for pegs. So, those little things are very strange and different for people that ride off-road motorcycles. So that video talks a lot about those subtleties, about the sound. One of the things that I found fascinating was you can hear the sound of traction. So suddenly traction isn't a seat of the pants feeling. It becomes part of your auditory experience. So another sense gets to help you define traction. You can feel the breaking point. You can hear it as it's about to break, and then you can hear the traction loss when it occurs, which is crazy because you could never hear those things over an internal combustion engine.
Right.
So that was one of the things that was revealed to me. It's just, wow, that's very cool. So anyway, we learned a tremendous amount. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it was a fascinating experience.
What about the issue of range? So, for instance, my example of an electric mountain bike, it worked for. I wanted to go for a 2 or 3 hour ride. The battery, was on a full charge when I started, and it was at 20% when I finished. So it worked out perfectly. There was no issue with my usage of it at all. Now, when you were on the Stark, I mean, you obviously have to, if you live in the middle of absolutely nowhere, you have to limit your range, and you have to be cognizant of that. What do you get a couple of hours out of them? I mean, I have absolutely no experience, so anything you can share would be useful.
Range is an issue for the majority at this point in the battery development. You can get 2.5 hard hours out of that bike, trail riding at a good pace, flowing, and tons of fun. But 2.5 hours, 3 hours, you're starting to push it. And it's going to depend, like, are you throttle happy? Are you a smooth, easy rider? What kind of terrain? Are you climbing hills at full speed? All that stuff has an effect, of course. But when I say that there's a percentage of off-road riders where the Stark would be perfect for them because they only have they're only going to ride for 2 or 3 hours in their small off-road park, and they're going to do their loops on their little thing. And, for them, they arrive at, say, 10 or 11 in the morning, they talk, they unload, they chatter in the parking lot, and then they go out for maybe some loops and come back to the parking lot. And I've lived in places where we ride like that. So for certain people, the Stark would be amazing. It would have lots of range because lots of guys don't ride more than 2.5 to 3 hours in an actual moving time. It's a big difference. Like, we track our hours on our combustion bikes, and we may be out for 7 hours, but our moving time is surprisingly low. It's like our moving time might be 2.5 to 3 hours because we're stopping and we're braking. It's the actual moving time or engine run time is not nearly as high as you think it is.
It's kind of like the average speed for your car. I know every now and then in my car, I'll hit the wrong buttons and I'll see the average speed and I'll think, well, that can't be right. I'm going 38 kilometers an hour for, on average for 340,000 kilometers or however long I've had the car. So
Right.
It is kind of shocking.
Yeah, like, for example, internal combustion engines, with a dirt bike, when you're getting to 100 hours, you're starting to think about mechanical issues like top end rebuilds and different things.
Right.
100 hours, when you think about that, that's like, well, I ride 8 hours every weekend, and I'm only going to get 10 weekends out of this bike before I have to do a top end. But that's just not actually how it goes. You go out with your friends and you probably put 2.5, 3, 4 hours of engine time on. So that 100 hours is going to take you a lot longer than you think. And for a dirt bike, an enormous amount of hours on a dirt bike would be 350 or 400. Like those are guys that are high flyers and you can't believe they've ridden their bikes that long. I've even heard of some KTMs with 500 hours on them, those old RFS engines. And that's a big deal. So yeah, engine hours are like your average, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
As we know that there's a lot of things shifting in the off-road motorcycle market, and one of the things that is most curious to my mind is the bikes get bigger and they get smaller at the same time. Not the same bike, different bikes. Because that would be magic, just like religion. So we won't talk about that. Because the confusing thing about marketing dirt bikes, and I remember doing a BMW riding course in the Black Forest, and there was this young guy who was teaching the course. We all had GSs, and he was a former German supermoto champion, and he'd ridden a couple of Moto 2 rounds, in the World Championship. And I mean, he could do things with that 1200 or 1250, whatever it was, GS. He could ride it up the downspout onto the roof, and then ride off the roof. I mean, he was one of those guys. And so, which makes you wonder, you think, well, if he can do it, can I do it? And of course the answer is no, I can't. And nor can most people. And yet this notion that, the ADV motorcycle, the big ones have essentially replaced the Harley as a vehicle of aspiration. So it used to be, in the 90s, you'd have your Harley and you'd ride it down to the coffee shop. Now you take your 1300 GS and your climb gear and, enough aluminum cases to put 3 dozen AK-47s in them, and you go to Starbucks. And that's a pretty common thing. And yet they are not really ideal off-road motorcycles for most people. So this is a roundabout way of me asking you, what do you see with the people coming to your course? What kind of bikes do they ride? What have they ridden? And do you think these big bikes really impede our ability to get better?
I will tell you about what I think is the big lie of adventure motorcycles. What's happening in adventure motorcycles right now is the manufacturers are partnering with people like Chris Birch, and that's my cat. Chris Birch, amazing person, amazing teacher, amazing rider. He's a superstar. He's a champion. But the big lie occurs when Chris Birch is on an 1190 KTM and he's doing absolutely ridiculous things, and the part that's left out of that is that Chris Birch learned how to ride small dirt bikes very well. I suspect he probably rode trials bikes. I know that he rode enduro bikes. He was a Romanian ex-champion. And those skills were developed on those smaller motorcycles. And the skills translate up, but they don't translate down. And what I mean by that is a trials rider will hop on a BMW 1200, and within 5 minutes, they're doing nose wheelies in the parking lot, and they're doing things on this BMW 1200 that you can't even imagine. Your jaw drops. But an expert level BMW 1200 rider with no other experience on other bikes is going to get on a trials bike and fall all over the place, or a dirt bike and fall off it lots and quickly and often. So the big lie is that the manufacturers are using these off-road phenoms, they're experts, to ride the adventure bikes in a way that is probably not possible for 98% of the population. So it gives people this skewed idea of what these bikes are going to allow them to do. And what often happens is you purchase the dream, which, I want as many people in off-road riding as possible, but I want them to stay. And that's the disconnect. So you buy the climb suit, you buy the GS, you buy the KTM 1290 or whatever it is that you buy. You're riding because you're a competent street rider. You're riding and it's incredible on the street. They're like scalpels. They're just beautiful to ride. But then the moment you take them off road, a series of variables get entered into the equation that they're completely unaware of, and it requires a lot of skill to ride the off-road motorcycle or the large adventure motorcycles. So off-road riding is a skill in itself. It's so complex, and that part gets left out of the marketing. It's just like, oh wow, look at this guy do these amazing things on this bike. When I buy the bike, I want to do those kinds of amazing things. And the disconnect for me is they buy the bike, they buy the dream, and then in the first season of riding it, they either scare themselves and don't tell anyone, especially their family, or they have the accident. So they have the crash, they shatter their tib fib, collarbone, whatever it is that they have an injury. And then if you can afford a motorcycle, like you said earlier in the conversation, we're in the top 1% if you can afford it. If you can afford a motorcycle in a Western culture, it means that you're also shouldering a lot of responsibility with family, career, finances. So your family and the people that count on you to stay healthy are going to look at you and raise their eyebrow and say, should you really be riding adventure motorcycles at your age? And I think they should, but the problem is if they don't understand off-road before the accident, they may leave before they actually can give it a proper chance. So that's what I'm seeing a lot. I'm seeing guys come in, they buy the dream, and then the injury occurs, or they scare themselves shitless and don't tell a soul, and they quietly sell everything and get out.
For our seventh inning stretch, some words provided by our sponsor. Picture this: you're in the garage, your favorite room in the house, and you're tuning up your engine with parts that you found on eBay. Every piece is just locking perfectly into place. You step back to admire your work, hands covered in grease. And because you're committed to riding that thing further than the odometer can even handle, you start thinking to yourself, you know what, I could probably also use some new brakes, maybe a shock. This baby deserves a new air filter. So you go back to eBay. You can find any part you need there. It's unreal. From headlights to air filters to exhaust systems, all the way to those carbon fiber rims you've been fantasizing about. eBay is the stocked garage of your dreams, and you've got eBay Guaranteed Fit. Because eBay knows DIY fixes can be major and mods are always intense. So you need to know those parts are guaranteed to fit every time before you dive in, wrench first. And on the off chance you order a part and it doesn't fit, send it back. Simple as that. You know what you love more than your bike itself, and that is, of course, riding it. You're serious when it comes to engine maintenance and locked in when you're headed into a build. And that's exactly why you start with eBay. Minor fix or complete overhaul. You want to get your ride back on the road, and you've got eBay Guaranteed Fit. So eBay created My Garage, where all you have to do is add your ride's info to get the exact parts that fit. When you see the green check, you're a click away from that part clicking perfectly into place. Now that you're aware of all this, just imagine standing at that open garage door, looking at the bike you love more than anything, knowing that anything is possible, whether it's keeping it on the road forever or turning it into something that's never been seen before. Because with eBay, your garage just got a whole lot bigger. Get all the parts you need at prices you'll love, guaranteed to fit every time. eBay, things people love. Now back to my conversation with Dallas Shannon. The Lowdown Show is presented by advrider.com and supported by ebaymotors.com. There's never been a better time, I think, to be a motorcyclist than now, certainly in terms of the vehicles that are available. I mean, it is stunning. I mean, I'm an Italian file. So, I mean, the fact that there's so many, there's a Aprilia Superbike, there's the Ducati Superbikes, there's so many options in that one little niche. And then, of course, the off-road thing is just exploding. Ducati and Triumph, two brands that I never thought would have made a serious off-roader, have 250 and 450 singles and are going to take on the world's toughest motocross series, which is, of course, the AMA series, I believe, next year. So, I mean, things are really shifting. But one thing I do find is that, God, we are a grumpy bunch, because you start reading through the comments on some of these motorcycles, and there are niches within niches within niches. But essentially, everybody's waiting for that, and I guess this is just human nature, but everybody's waiting for that impossible motorcycle that costs, as much as a Himalayan 450 and cruises at 160 kilometers an hour and gets, 78 miles to the gallon of fuel. And it just seems like we're pretty grumpy, aren't we? And we're pretty dissatisfied, even though it's never been more. It's never been a better time to get any kind of bike in any kind of discipline. Do you find this?
Nobody hates a motorcyclist like another motorcyclist.
Oh God, yeah.
It's crazy. It's so, we're wired to be so tribal, just from a biological perspective, anthropological perspective.
Right.
And then when you look at off-road, because that's my specialty, so it's like you have trials riders, which are their own beast, their own tribe. You have enduro riders, you have trail riders. Then you go up into dual sport guys, which are in the 350 to say 650 cc range. Then you have adventure bikers. We're all riding off road, and we should all get along really well. But those disciplines are so segmented, and the dual sporters hate the enduro guys, and enduro guys hate the adventure guys, and it's like everyone hates everyone inside this. And then you bring brands into it, which are preying on our tribalism. KTM's a great example of excellent marketing and a tribalistic marketing. Like, you're going to buy into KTM because of the marketing, and you're going to believe the marketing, and they're doing an amazing job, but it's very tribal. It's very tribal. So yeah, I don't know. Like, it's always bothered me and frustrated me, but I understand at the same point. Like, I mean, I am one of those tribal people as well. So I fight not to be, but it's difficult because everyone's preying on our tribalistic natures to sell, sell, sell.
And also, we as motorcyclists, and I think this has a lot to do with being male, but we want to be taken seriously. We don't want to be a play motorcyclist. We want to be a serious motorcyclist. So that for me, that on my road race bikes, it means I have to have cantankerous Ducatis, and the same thing goes for off road. And I was, before we started recording, I was telling you the story of going to northern Quebec on a KLX 300 Kawasaki, and everyone else had hardcore KTMs. And at the end of the day, I was 5 minutes behind them and totally relaxed. Body felt great because the suspension is nice and soft. And they were destroyed after 3 or 4 days. Their bodies were done. And yet the cheaper bike with absolutely no cachet was really, I think, the best choice for that situation.
Yeah, what I find is, I've been doing this over 15 years at this point, and we see a lot of people cycle through our programs. I see a lot of men from all over the world, and I tell people my job is to keep the lid on the pot, which means I am trying to control their testosterone and their ego early on. And we're because we're men and we're filled with testosterone, our egos really dominate our choices. And the problem with an ego and testosterone and that competitive nature to be a serious motorcyclist, it gets you hurt off-road very, very quickly. And part of the reason I like off-road is because the sport itself, the nature of it, physically corrects you painfully when you lose your humility.
Right.
So it's and entering with ego and testosterone is going to get you hurt very quickly. And to play on ego and testosterone in the marketing, which lots of companies do, it's almost a disservice. I understand that they're trying to sell product and they're using our emotions, but it's almost a disservice to the sport itself. The purest portion of the sport itself. Take the sales and the marketing and the industry portion out.
What do you find when people come to your schools? First of all, are they honest about their riding capabilities, or do they kind of bullshit a little bit? And what are they open to learning? Because I've also heard people say at some schools that sometimes people get so frustrated that they just hit a block and they can't transcend this because they're so miffed that. Little sidebar here. I went mountain biking in the Canary Islands a few years ago between launches, and there was a bunch of there was a German cycling group, who admonished me for riding dangerously. And I thought, it's a bicycle. Come on. You should see what I do the rest of the time. And there were these Norwegian lesbians, about 4'8", these minuscule women who were by far the best cyclists, and they kicked everyone's ass, which I thought was glorious. But the Germans had a lot of problem with this, that just because it didn't fit their idea of, they had all the gear and they had all the training and so it's kind of the same thing, isn't it? We go into these things with it reflecting too much, I think, of the way we view ourselves. So what do you find when people come to see you? You come to your thing. Are there? Can you break it down into 2 or 3 archetypes that you habitually run into?
It's such a good question. I think my primary role at this point is expectation setting. I'm in a business of expectation setting. And because we've had trouble with a man's ability to self-assess accurately, I am now doing interviews. So I literally do interviews with every single person that applies to come on our rides. But I understand the chuckle. I'm doing it, and I feel like I'm doing it in their best interest, because I don't want them spending their money and their time flying across the world to come to Canada to have a bad time. And if their expectations are not aligned with what we're actually doing, or if they're not a good fit if they don't have the skill set or the experience to do whatever that shenanigan that we're going to partake in this year, then I discourage them. I tell lots of people it's not a good idea, and I'm not accepting you to come on this particular event. Now that said, in their defense, and this actually happened, and this is the story that I tell to illustrate this point. I had a gentleman that told me that he rides his KLR 650 dirt bike at an expert level, and he's better than everybody else. So I thought, oh man, like, we ride enduro bikes in the woods and 2-strokes, and it's crazy. And he thinks that his KLR 650 is a dirt bike. And in his defense, he thinks that, he truly does. And when I got him on the phone, he told me that all his friends ride 1000cc motorcycles. So he's got the small agile dirt bike in his group. They were from the Canadian prairies, so there's no hills, there's no challenging ups and downs. They ride mostly gridded, 2-track or ATV trails. And so in his mind, he was the expert of his group. He was an expert level rider, but he had never ridden anywhere else. So, once again, in his defense, like, he doesn't know where he actually belongs to cross into a different world. So I get a lot of that. Like, I get a lot of people saying my GS 1200 dirt bike, and that's a real, it's a clue that I need to investigate this more about what their experience levels and what their expectation levels are. So I think in general we have poor self-assessment, but skill on a motorcycle is very subjective. It's like, where have you ridden? What do you ride? What's your experience? How many years? So it's like, it's very difficult to get to get an objective answer on such a subjective topic. So the interviews help. I'm pretty frank when it comes to what to expect. Physical fitness is important in an off-road environment, because I can see, I once took a triathlete dirt biking on an XR 650R, so a kickstart, big heavy pig. He must have dropped that bike 75 times during the ride, and he picked it up every time and kickstarted it with a smile on his face, and he never got tired. So it's like, fitness actually matters. Yeah. So those are the things I see, like our ego, our perceptions, our own reality, it's all subjective. So I try to cut through that in the interviews, and no fault of the men on the other end of the interview. That's where they are. That's what they believe, and rightly or wrongly. So I try to tune it where they understand what we're doing and what's expected of them. And if they agree, then I was very honest with them about what they're going to face.
The Lowdown Show is presented by advrider.com and supported by ebaymotors.com. something that's always really related specifically to my riding, because I worked at a magazine and I rode, I've ridden on a racetrack with world champions. I went at the Erzberg Rodeo. I went for a little media spin with Cyril Dupree one year. So, because I think typically what happens, Dallas, is, at least in my experience, is if you've got you ride with 6 guys, if you're the fastest guy of those 6, you're fast. But that's such a small sample. When you ride, I mean, I flat tracked against Nicky Hayden in the 90s. And they do things on a motorcycle that you shouldn't be able to do. Physics, and I will stand by this. Physics do not affect them in the way that they affect me. They seem to be able to go faster with less lean angle, which is impossible. And yet they can do it. And Cyril Dupree, what he could do with one hand, climbing these hills that I didn't think were climbable. I mean, the skill set is just so astonishing that, we think there's 3 or 4 levels, but there's 3 or 4,000 levels of rider capability. And so the idea that anyone would have the hubris to think that they're really good on something is just shocking to me, because I do the opposite. I'm actually, if I can say so, I'm actually a better rider than I give myself credit for. My problem is I've been around exceptional riders for so long, and I'm merely sort of good, but good doesn't seem very good compared to them. So, I guess the point that I'm trying to make is we all come from this with different experiences, don't we? And my experience, having worked in media, would be very different than someone who's ridden with his 4 friends and who thinks, his KLR is a scalpel. Yeah. And you have to figure this all out before they get to you, because if you make a mess of it, then you've ruined their trip.
That's correct. And that's why I'm so forgiving to the applicants and the people that I speak with, is because they haven't seen, or maybe they haven't seen a world class, or maybe they don't understand the amount of levels there actually is in the sport. And that goes for all hierarchies, like NHL, NFL, Major League Baseball, NBA basketball. It's like, as you go higher up the hierarchy, there are clear leaps between one level and the other, objective leaps, and either you're going to make the leap or you're not. And if you're near the bottom of that hierarchy, or you're in the middle, but you get to bump up against someone that's near the top, they seem alien-like and otherworldly to you. Like, it just, how is that possible? But there's maybe 6, 7, 8, 9 levels between you and them, and they work their way through that in probably a very painstaking way to get to where they are. But we don't know. We just see the massive difference and think that's impossible. And I get it, because I've had those experiences as well.
It's also it's deceptive when you watch these sorts of riders on TV, and also when there's it's like that. Here's one of my bizarre theories: is that, say the 100-meter dash at the Olympics, they should have an 11th lane where they take an average schmuck out of the audience, right? A guy in decent shape who's, I don't know, 38 years old, who goes to the gym twice a week. A decent Sam. We don't want him to die, because that's bad for ratings if he collapses. But just to see what it would be like if we were out there. And you think, oh, I see. Gotcha. Because he'd be at the 40 meters mark. Well, everyone else would be finished.
Yeah. But what we'd say is, I'm better than that guy.
So we'd start judging him.
Yeah, well, who, and I'm going to speak in an off-road world. You could translate this into street, but it's like, you watch Erzberg Rodeo, which is one of arguably the most difficult events in the world on off-road motorcycles, and you're watching these clips and you're like, oh man, I wouldn't have made that mistake. I would have did this and I would have did that. And it's like, you have no idea like how unbelievably, like, it's not even possible that an average human being could even be there. Like, it's so far away from an average. They had a lot of series on YouTube about this, where they take pro athletes or former pros, still in not their prime, but they're not far off their prime, and they'll put them against guys that play in the beer league, just to see what happens. And it's it's not even fair in any way. Like
No.
men do not realize what that means at any sport where there's a hierarchy that goes up to the top. Like, we can't fathom the difference.
Let's sort of wrap things up with a little talk about your school, and give me, if you would, some more examples of, or, what sort of your programs are like, what I can expect if I come to ride with you. Do you go short distance, long distance, multi-day? Take me through some of the things you do.
So the educational offering that we have now was very specifically designed. What was happening was we were doing 1, 2, and 3-day adventure camps. And those adventure camps where guys would come in with their adventure motorcycle and they would bring their own bike, and we would try our best to train them up on how to ride that motorcycle off-road. The problem that occurred was that it was increasingly obvious that the consequences of those men learning to ride off-road on those huge motorcycles was not fair or ethical to put those people in a situation where they could get injured on these bikes. Like, I felt the consequences were too high, both financially, so their motorcycle, but also physically. Like, if they were to get injured, like, that's going to affect them. So we designed the class that we're doing now. Is called XTADV, so Cross Training Adventure. And we're taking people with lots of street experience who have been bitten by the adventure bug, and we're placing them on 250cc Honda motorcycles. We're sponsored by Honda. They have been incredible. They believe in our programs. They've been amazing. So the 250F is an air-cooled, proper trail bike. I describe it as a Labrador Retriever. It's not going to bite you, and it's going to be good with the family and the kids. It's not going to try to kill you all the time. So it's a perfect motorcycle for them to learn. And then what we do is we train them up to become enduro riders. So we pretend you know nothing. We're going to start from the very basics of riding off-road, and we're going to build you up over 1 week. So 5 days, we're going to build them up to be enduro riders. The reason I made it 5 days was what I realized what was happening, even with our enduro classes. Guys would come in for a day or 2 days or 3 days, and they're learning a lot of knowledge, but it's just still in their head. So with this class, what we're doing is we're giving them fundamentals, and we are giving them so many repetitions that we're trying to squeeze it into their muscle memory by the time they leave on Friday. And what I notice, and it's been, hugely successful, I see a bunch of terrified ducklings waddle in on Monday morning with their eyes like saucers. And then Friday afternoon, I see a group that is walking around with their spurs jingling and jangling, and they got so much confidence riding off-road. It's shocking. What the transformation is shocking. So we train in the mornings, we ride a little bit in the afternoons, but it's focused. It's a very intense learning experience, and I model it as and you would know this, Neil, from sports practices. So time on the clock, structured drills, there's no time wasted, because I feel it's my responsibility to give these men and women as much information, as many reps as I possibly can in the time that they're with me. And I'm going to send them away with skills that are going to remain with them the rest of their riding life. And so it was muscle memory was the real key for the design of the architecture curriculum of the educational program.
In closing, words provided by our sponsor. Picture this: you're halfway through a DIY motorcycle fix, tools scattered everywhere, and boom, you realize you're missing a part. Well, it's okay, because whatever it is, it's on eBay. They've got simply everything: brake rotors, lights, and tire exhaust systems, whatever you need. And it's guaranteed to fit, which means no more crossing your fingers and hoping you ordered the right thing. All the parts you need at prices you'll love, guaranteed to fit every time. eBay, things people love. Thank you for listening to The Lowdown Show.